Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. It's another one of our All Things Africa edition. We continue to explore the history and current affairs of each African country, and we are continuing to explore Southern Africa, the Southern African region. And this episode, we look at the history and current affairs of Zimbabwe. And who better to teach us about this country or any African country than our historical guide, our tour guide, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports. Abayomi is a longtime historian, journalist, Pan-Africanist, leftist activist. And just before we begin, a reminder to our audience to please, before we start, share us, share widely 1+1's content, past and present episodes, our playlists, help us overcome the far-right algorithms that the dominant monopoly Western corporate state media and pseudo-leftist websites have in the social media world by, again, sharing our content. Share us across social media and email, and please donate if you can to 1+1 at our PayPal. And if people are having trouble and would prefer an alternative form of donation, contact me at yurismouter@gmail.com. And, excuse me, Facebook sometimes blocks my ability to share widely. So again, please share. It helps the show immensely. It's our only way of overcoming the colonial, pro-imperialist, sexist, heteronormative, and racist media. And also, folks, don't forget to help my colleague and friend Chris Richards, the eclectic radical, out by who is struggling with unemployment. Become a Patreon of his, and if you help Chris out, you're helping me out with future journalism projects we want to do, which we need people to donate. So now, on to the topic at hand. So, Abayomi, first off, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
And as always, Abayomi, tell us what was Zimbabwe like before British colonialism took over the nation? How did it become a British colony, which was called Southern Rhodesia, which was named after the mining white supremacist jerkwad Cecil Rhodes? And what were the conditions like for the indigenous African population under Anglo rule?
The human settlements and human habitation in Zimbabwe can be traced back to at least 100,000 years. So this is a long period of time, thousands and thousands of years of human habitation. Also the development of various civilizations. The initial inhabitants, like other areas of Southern and Central Africa, were the San people, the so-called Bushmen.
Yes.
Other areas, they were called the Pygmies. They were there. They can be traced back further than any other human settlements. There's evidence of production of tools for hunting and gathering, and also rock carvings that exist in various caves throughout the area now known as Zimbabwe. Of course, you had the migration of other peoples from the east and central part of Africa. These groups have been described as, quote, the Bantu, unquote, and we had discussed the whole definition and interpretation of Bantu.
Exactly.
The people there, apparently they got it from the indigenous people there, as they refer to themselves as people, as Muntu. So at any rate,
exactly, just like the Los Angeles Angels, which would translate to the Angels.
Right, exactly. So, but they had to have categories to put people in, and these are the categories we're working with even today, as far as the 21st century is concerned. You had the development of more centralized civilizations beginning around the 8th and 9th century with the Zizo civilization. Was one of the earlier ones. Later, there was the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, and later the Kingdom of Mutapa. Now, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe is the most notable because of its large wall structures. And this kingdom extended not only to modern-day Zimbabwe, but it also had outposts in modern-day Mozambique, as well as Zambia. So as we talked about before, the categories and the borderlines that were drawn by the Europeans prior to the Berlin Conference of 1884 going all the way back to perhaps the 15th century, and then what existed after the Berlin Conference overlaps with the modern day nation states. So the walls of Zimbabwe, or the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, extended a tremendous amount of territory, even into the areas that were later attacked and subdued and colonized by the Portuguese. So it was the Portuguese who initially found out that this great walled civilization existed. Now, there's been tremendous debate over what the purpose and the utility of the walls of Zimbabwe were. Some say that they represented the dynasties that dominated at that time, the monarchies that dominated. Others say it had religious connotations. Some say it was built around the existence of the rulers as well as commoners in that particular area. But there was one large wall that was built. But in addition to that, there were many, many others that were built around Zimbabwe and also in modern day Mozambique. What's interesting about this is that the Europeans, when they first fell upon the Great Walls of Zimbabwe, could not accept the fact that they had been built by indigenous Africans. And this became a problem, particularly under the British, when they were coming in attempting to take over Zimbabwe, southern Rhodesia, because their whole narrative was that the land was occupied by people who were inferior, who had very limited civilization and culture. So therefore, they came up with all these ridiculous and fraudulent historical narratives that the Great Walls of Zimbabwe were actually built by Europeans or the Phoenicians or perhaps Arabs who lived along the eastern coast. So these myths continued for many, many years up until the 1950s. And even then, there was severe censorship on anyone who was doing archaeological or historical research in southern Rhodesia to distort the realities of their findings, to say that actually, no, it was not Africans, they were not descendants of the Shona-speaking populations, that they were in fact attributed to Europeans or perhaps Asians who they felt, in fact, who they attempted to disguise as well as Europeans or largely European in terms of their biological heritage. So this gives you some background. You also had the kingdom of the Mapun Gubwe, which was a successor to the Zizo kingdom. And they existed around the confluence of the Shasha and the Zambezi rivers in Zimbabwe. These were also large civilizations encompassing thousands of people and spread out over thousands of kilometers. And then, of course, there were others that came into existence. We talked about the walls of Great Zimbabwe. It's estimated that this civilization was initiated around 1000 AD during the so-called Christian era. And as we said, it continued for another 3 centuries, and it peaked around the period of the 13th century, between the 13th and the 15th centuries. And I mentioned the fact that the Portuguese discovered, well, not necessarily discovered, became aware of the fact that this civilization existed, not only in Mozambique, but also in Zimbabwe and other areas as well. And they began to interfere in the internal workings of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe and its successors, Mutapa and others. And this caused disturbances, conflicts, coups d'etats. We're talking about pre-colonial disruptions. And of course, a similar situation had developed further to the north, around Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, and so forth, when the Portuguese intervened. And we talked about that when we reviewed the history of Mozambique several weeks ago. So these are some of the developments which occurred during the period, the pre-colonial period. Also, slavery. The Portuguese were heavily involved in the Atlantic slave trade. they and the Spanish are considered the founders and the originators of the Atlantic slave trade. And of course, by the late 15th century, we mentioned Vasco da Gama last week. They began to set up forts, and they involved themselves in not only slave trade, but also the theft of strategic resources. And this became a key aspect of the colonization of what was known then as Southern Rhodesia, which later became known as Zimbabwe. They wanted the gold, they wanted the diamonds, they wanted the strategic location of these areas in order to promote and to advance the economic dominance of Europe. So, yes, this gives you some background in regard to what actually existed there prior to the advent of the Portuguese, and of course, later the British, who came in during the late 19th century. Now, there was migration and the shifting of various groups, particularly during the early part of the 19th century. This was prompted by something that is described as the Infokani, which is like the disaster or the displacement. Now, traditionally, in regard to European scholarship, they attempted to attribute the Infokani to the Zulu, the Amazulu civilization under Shaka during the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Yeah.
There's been a revision of that outlook in recent years as more Africans became trained in European scholarship. They began writing, doing their own research based upon the actual documents, as well as the oral histories. And it indicates that the intervention of the Europeans, the so-called Afrikaners or the Boers, along with the British, prompted instability, dislocation, theft of land and livestock, which triggered these migrations and these conflicts which took place in the Southern Africa region, beginning in the early decades of the 19th century, extending all the way to around 1840. So in regard to Zimbabwe, you had a breakoff from the Zulu nation by the Ndebele people, who were a section of the Zulu people. They apparently fled the area that is today known as South Africa and entered Zimbabwe and set up what is called today Matabele land. Now, some of the early leaders of the Matabele land kingdom were people like Gazwani and later Mzilikazi. Mzilikazi is known as a great warrior who spread the Matabele civilization into Zimbabwe. His son was a man named Lobengula, who became a warrior against the British colonialists when they tried to trick him and then try to steal land and resources from the Matabele people. The Shona people, who are considered the originators of the kingdoms of Zimbabwe and their successors, were already weakened as a result of climatic changes and also the interference of the Portuguese by the period of the 17th and 18th centuries. So you had this dislocation that was taking place, the movement among people, and this attributes to this whole archaeological, anthropological, and historical myths of the land without a people, that was taken over for people without a land.
Yeah.
They use the same narrative today in Palestine, and they also use it in Southern Africa. There was hardly no one there. It was a barren and desolate land before the white man came in and built up civilization. And we still hear that today in regard to Palestine.
And there are still far right white nationalist junk historians in Australia that say similar things about the Aboriginal people, the arguably oldest civilizations on the planet, and they still say all sorts of just ridiculous, like racist nonsense like that. So
these were self-serving narratives because they justify the conquering of people's land, their virtual enslavement. Even though the British had outlawed the Atlantic slave trade as early as the 1807, and internal slavery in Britain, even going back to the 1770s. Nonetheless, they had a different scheme for labor exploitation and resource theft, and that became classical colonialism, which was instituted largely after the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. So that brings us up to the period of British colonialism, which really picked up speed during the 1870s and 1880s.
Interesting. And now, okay, so that definitely explains how Britain formally got all of its different territories, and of course with World War I, that strengthens British colonialism and French colonialism in the continent of Africa. So, uh, talk a little bit about what the conditions were like for the people of Zimbabwe under British colonialism, Cecil Rhodes, when it comes to Zimbabwe, and then I'll ask how, yeah, and I'll get to my other question after that.
Well, just to point out that the Africans resisted the encroachment of British imperialism. By 1896, it was quite clear what their intentions were. So they organized a revolt. Both the Ndebele as well as the Mashona people organized armed struggles to drive out the British between 1896 and 1898. And these battles were fierce and they were very bloody. A lot of people were killed and displaced. And it wasn't until 1898 that the British could claim empire over the people in Matabele land as well as Mashona land. So the people fought vigorously. Lubengula was one of the warriors who had fought the British. He was eventually fought and he died during the war. The Mashona fought vigorously as well, and some of their leaders were captured. The top leaders, a woman named Nahanda, who was considered a spirit medium. The word Nahanda goes back centuries in Shona culture, and Kagubi, who was her partner. And they were eventually captured and hung by the British because they refused to compromise, refused to accept Christianity, refused to accept British dominance over their people, and they were killed. This war between 1896 and 1898 is considered the first Chimurenga, meaning the first war of national liberation.
Wow.
So the second Chimurenga took place in the 1960s and 1970s. We could talk about that later. But the actual conditions of Africans in Zimbabwe, and which was considered Southern Rhodesia and Northern Rhodesia at the time, Mozambique, South Africa, the entire region were horrendous under colonialism. The British, under Cecil Rhodes, set up what they call the South African Company, and they ruled the area, even absent of British oversight in terms of British governmental oversight. So they became a de facto colonial power, and they were a exploitative, rapacious system that stole land. They stole natural resources for the purpose of Britain. They forced the overwhelming majority of Africans in Zimbabwe onto what they call reserves, which were really labor camps or concentration camps, taking their land away. And then they forced people to pay taxes, hut taxes, for their own land. So this is what happened between the late 1890s all the way up until around 1922, when they shifted from the South African Company to becoming a British colony. But they were a settler colony because they sent a lot of British citizens to Zimbabwe to settle there in order to administer the colonial system. So this started happening heavily during the 1920s through the 1950s.
Fascinating, and that's a perfect segue to this question, which is now when Zimbabwe became independent, and correct me if I'm wrong. So when Zimbabwe became independent, it was still known as Southern Rhodesia, and it was one of those uh, as you already mentioned, British settler colonial states that more or less was like the U.S. Jim Crow system and the South African apartheid system, and then that independent Southern Rhodesia later gets overthrown by armed struggle. Am I very correct in how I'm characterizing Zimbabwean history like that?
Yes, well, remember we discussed this when we talked about Northern Rhodesia, that there was a federation set up, Federation of the Rhodesians and Nyasaland in 1953. Now, the indigenous Africans opposed this. They organized against it. They petitioned against it to no avail. This combined Nyasaland, which later became Malawi, with Southern Rhodesia, which later became Zimbabwe, and Northern Rhodesia, which became Zambia. Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia became independent in 1964 after a long, protracted political struggle that took place. In 1964, under Ian Smith's group, his political party, they declared themselves independent from the British because they did not want to hold multi-party elections, which they knew Africans, one of the African liberation movements or political parties would win. So in the 1950s, there were various groups that formed throughout the region. The Southern Rhodesian African National Congress was a counterpart to the Northern Rhodesian African National Congress, which was allied with the South African National Congress. So a lot of these movements were unified during the post-World War II period. And then they were banned in Southern Rhodesia. And the groups were banned because they were advocating for independence, particularly after 1957, when you had the independence of Ghana. Robert Mugabe, for example, who was a school teacher at the time, went into exile in Ghana during the late 1950s. And he, of course, studied there and became a leading figure in the movement. So after the ANC of Rhodesia was banned by the racist authorities in what later became known as Zimbabwe, another group called the National Democratic Party was formed. They only lasted maybe a year or two, and they were banned as well. Eventually, in the early 1960s, around 1961, a man named Joshua Nkomo formed what was known as the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU.
Yeah.
And Mugabe was a part of this organization up until 1963. And there was a split between the Zimbabwe African National Union, which emerged from ZAPU.
Yeah.
ZANU initially was led by a man named Ndabaningi Sithole, who later on, well, we'll talk about that, but, became a very controversial figure. Yeah. And Mugabe was the Secretary General, elected as Secretary General in 1963, even though he was living at the time in the West African state of Ghana. In fact, his first wife, Sally Mugabe, was a Ghanaian woman. So Mugabe eventually returned to Zimbabwe and was imprisoned. Nkomo was imprisoned as well. But after it was clear that there was no reforms that were going to be initiated by the British, and particularly these settlers who were there, who were following Ian Smith. In 1965, they declared a unilateral Declaration of Independence. In 64, ZAPU began the armed struggle. In 1965, ZANU began an armed struggle as well. ZAPU, they had the Zimbabwe Independence Revolutionary People's Army, ZIPRA, and ZANU formed the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA. They were fighting separately initially for the first, perhaps, decade of the struggle, gaining better results initially. But things began to pick up during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Eventually, they formed the Patriotic Front, which was an alliance between the ZAPU, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, and the Zimbabwe African National Union. So they became ZANU-PF and ZAPU-PF. So this is what was happening during the period. But it wasn't isolated, what was going on in Zimbabwe. As I mentioned, Zambia became independent in late 1964. They were able to provide aid and assistance to the people who were still fighting in Zimbabwe. Tanzania became independent in 1961. They were providing assistance, military and educational and other forms of assistance to the liberation movements in Zimbabwe. So all of this was going on. And then in South Africa, after the Sharpeville incident of 1960, both the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was formed in 1959 as a result of the split within the ANC, they were both banned in 1960. And in 1961, they both declared that they would embark upon an armed struggle because there was no other option. Same situation in Zimbabwe. The whites were so racist and so intransigent that they would not even negotiate or provide any serious reforms to the African people. So they had to embark upon an armed struggle. So this happened in South Africa around 1961, then later in Southern Rhodesia and Zimbabwe in 1964, 1965. Now the UDI on the part of Ian Smith was ostensibly rejected internationally, even by the British government, although they did not take direct action against it. And it was the same situation with the United States, even though purportedly they did not recognize the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. They were not willing to take economic and military action to put it down.
Okay, and, interesting.
This is one of the key factors that led to the overthrow of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah as president of the Republic of Ghana, because he had called for the military overthrow of the Unilateral Declaration of Independence under Ian Smith. And he accused both Britain and the United States of being complicit in this Unilateral Declaration of Independence, the UDI. And of course, that, and as well as the publication of the book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, so incensed US imperialism that G. Menon Williams, who was the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs for the State Department, wrote a memorandum to the Ghana government protesting the book Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism.
Okay.
G. Menon Williams had been governor of the state of Michigan during the 1950s. And then he attempted to run for governor. He attempted to run for another, he attempted to run for president in 1960, but did not do well. Kennedy was elected in 1960. So Kennedy made him the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs with the State Department.
Is he what you call a Dixiecrats, one of the more sort of
Williams? He was considered a liberal.
Pro-Jim Crow Democrats is the most polite way I can describe them.
Yeah, G. Menon Williams from Michigan was considered I would call him a Cold War liberal. Okay. You know, these people who were considered liberals. John F. Kennedy Sr., who was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1954. In 1958, after the independence movements began to gain traction, he started the Senate Subcommittee on Africa. Now, he didn't do that because he was a raving independence advocate for the African continent. He did it because they saw that the Soviet Union and China were also very interested in the African independence movements. They did not want the newly independent African states to move towards socialism. So they were advocating independence from European colonies, but not for the purpose of becoming socialists and anti-imperialists, but keeping those former colonies within the Western camp. This was the
Exactly.
problem they had with countries like Tanzania, Ghana, Guinea, Algeria, and so forth. They could not control them. The same problem they had with Congo. This was under Eisenhower, where they were quite concerned when the Soviet Union agreed to provide assistance to Lumumba in 1960 because of the mutiny on the part of the Force Publique and, of course, the Belgians' intransigence in regard to moving their forces and their interests out of the Republic of Congo during 1960. So, but the point is that when Nkrumah and others began to move more towards a leftist position and establishing diplomatic relations with China, I believe Nkrumah was the first African state to form diplomatic relations with China, particularly sub-Saharan African states. That caused a lot of consternation on the part of the imperialists. So this is what happened. So in 1965, Nkrumah's objection to the UDI, his breaking of diplomatic relations, withdrawing from the British Commonwealth and so forth, contributed to creating the atmosphere for the overthrow of the Ghana government in February of 1966, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Now, they made it look like it was the military and the police that were behind the coup d'etat, that their motivation was that Nkrumah had become a dictator and that he had to be removed. Well, this was nonsense. Documents today show, and people speculated about this as early as 1966, Nkrumah in his book, Dark Days in Ghana, which was published in 1968, said that, it was the CIA and the U.S. State Department that had overthrown him. But those documents became available during the late 1970s. So now we have the evidence. We have the smoking gun that they created the atmosphere and they actually funded the Central Intelligence Agency, the overthrow of the Nkrumah government. So
with also British and Canadian support, I'm pretty sure.
Support as well. Yeah, that has come out as well. So,
but when it comes to Zimbabwe, but basically the Ian Smith apartheid government, which was neither officially supported or officially denied, denounced by the U.S., Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and so forth. But what collapsed that government was the armed struggle, which Robert Mugabe was a part of.
Yeah, the armed struggle escalated during the late 1960s, during the 1970s. It really became protracted. And as I said, it was operating in conjunction with the MPLA in Angola, Frelimo in Mozambique, the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, and of course, what was happening in South Africa and Namibia as well. So in 1974, there was a coup d'etat in Portugal on April 25th. And one of the first executive orders that the junior officers issued was that they were going to abandon their colonies overseas. So dates were set for the independence of the Portuguese colonies in Africa. In Guinea-Bissau, it was in 1974. In Mozambique, it was June of 1975. In Angola, it was November of 1975. So after Mozambique became independent, the war was still raging in what became known as Zimbabwe. So what Ian Smith did, his army, the Rhodesian Armed Forces, they created through the remnants of the Portuguese secret police and saboteurs, a group called the Mozambique National Resistance. It was created actually by the Rhodesians. And
Renamo, you mean?
Renamo, yes.
Yeah, he was part of creating that far-right party, which still exists in Mozambique.
Exactly, and they engaged in sabotage, in mass murder, and so forth. But that was all set up by the Rhodesians and later by the apartheid regime in South Africa. But under colonialism, in Zimbabwe. It was a very vicious, exploitative system. We talked about the uh, placing people in reserves, stealing their land. There was also massive amounts of sexual violence against African women, widespread rape, as well as police brutality that took place. It was institutionalized inside the colony during that particular time period. We're talking about the late 19th century all the way up until the time of independence. So yes, it was a very bad system, and there was a tremendous amount of incentive on the part of Africans to take up arms and to fight to overthrow that system.
And what
So
and what year did uh yeah and in what year did the government fall? And basically there was a sort of a new celebration. I think some Zimbabweans would even consider this was their real independence, and I believe that was sometime in the late 1970s, or when specifically.
what happened was that by 1977 and 1978, it became clear to the settler colonial regime under Ian Smith in southern Rhodesia that they had to make some maneuvers to try to stave off a military defeat at the hands of the liberation movements. They saw what had happened in Mozambique and Angola and Guinea-Bissau. They saw the war escalating in Namibia, and they also saw the masses rising up in the Republic of South Africa, particularly after 1976 with the youth and worker uprising that year. So it was like clear that they had to do something. So they tried to buy off some of the more moderate African leaders. A man by the name of Bishop Abel Muzorewa, who had a group called the United African National Council. And then there was Ndabaningi Sithole, who represented a faction of ZANU, more moderate faction, because Mugabe and the others had already split, Shetipo and others, Herbert Shetipo. So yes, so they cut a deal with Muzorewa and Ndabaningi Sithole to create a transitional government. And they even held elections in 1978 and then called the outcome of those elections Zimbabwe Rhodesia. It was a complete fraud of what they were trying to do. But they didn't fool the revolutionaries in Zimbabwe, and they didn't fool the liberation movement supporters internationally or in the region of Southern Africa or anywhere else in Africa. Nobody recognized, the Organization of African Unity did not recognize the so-called Zimbabwe Rhodesia construct. And the war continued. And they were losing more and more territory, more and more property was being lost on the part of the settler colonialists. So by late 1979, the British and the Americans under Jimmy Carter, they stepped in and actually forced Ian Smith to hold discussions over a transition, a democratic transition. So you had the advent of the Lancaster House talks in late 1979. There was an agreement in December of 1979, and that resulted in the suspension of the armed struggle on the part of ZIPRA, which was the military wing of ZAPU, and ZANLA, which is the military wing of the Zimbabwe African National Union. So both military wings of the Patriotic Front suspended the armed struggle. Further discussions took place. They agreed to hold elections several months later. The outcome of those elections brought ZANU-PF, which had the overwhelming support of the people inside the country. And second in line was ZAPU. ZANU was led by Robert Mugabe, and ZAPU was led by Joshua Nkomo. So they were able to set up a government in April of 1980.
Okay.
It was a transitional government in the sense that there were 20% of the parliamentary seats that were reserved for whites up to a period of 5 years. So in 1980, they became independent. It was a huge celebration of the independence. Bob Marley and the Wailers.
Ah,
Uh,
you stole that from me. I was going to mention that, but yes.
the year before, they came out with an album, and on that album, there was a track called Zimbabwe, which
Yeah,
electrified.
one of my favorite songs from him, one of my favorite protest songs. It's a song I listen to
Yeah,
in my darkest moments. When a lot of times when I thought that the Syrian Arab Republic was going to win, but even when they lost against the imperialists, I often would play that song as a comfort song. But yeah, great one, great.
exactly. So I saw Bob Marley live in December of 1979 when that album was out, and it was an amazing experience. That was the last time he visited the city of Detroit. He got sick several months later and stopped performing, and he died in May of 1981. But that was a major tribute to the armed struggle in Zimbabwe, and Peter Tosh as well. His album from 1977 entitled Equal Rights also, talks about, the struggle in Zimbabwe and so forth. So the reggae music, which originated, well, it's an African music, but it originated in the Caribbean island of Jamaica, became a major force culturally in promoting African liberation, particularly the liberation of Southern Africa. So Zimbabwe.
Although we do have to say their lionization of Ali Selassie,
The Rastafari, yeah,
not really good history, especially the song Buffalo Soldiers.
yeah, that's yeah one contradiction, and of course, yeah, but the Rastafari, we could talk about them later, but yeah, you have to look at the fact that they were created uh, with the ascendancy of Haile Selassie, and they viewed it as a sign of the coming independence and unity of Africa, particularly after the defeat of the Italian fascists who had invaded in 1935 and they were defeated in 1941. But yes, Zimbabwe became independent in 1980. Mugabe became prime minister for 5 years. And then in 85, they became a republic. Now, when they first became independent, there was soon a conflict between the leadership of ZAPU and ZANU to the
Yes.
point where people were arrested, they were killed. The 5th Brigade of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces that had been trained in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, was sent to Matabeleland to put down this rebellion. And Joshua Nkomo fled Zimbabwe for a number of years. So there was that split that occurred during the early 1980s. And then in 1985, the coalition was dissolved. The whites no longer had 20% of the seats reserved, and they became a republic, which meant, one person, one vote. That was in 1985.
Okay, actually, and that's a great place to ask this question. So, from the moment Zimbabwe became no more an apartheid settler colonial state, and up until he meaning Robert Mugabe was overthrown in the military coup and lost support from his own ruling party. At least that's the official story, ZANU-PF. Zimbabwe was governed by Robert Mugabe, April 1980 to November 21st, 2017. So now for the rest of the conversation, we will be covering Mugabe and Zimbabwe and Zimbabwean history by decade. So Abayomi, you will give us then your assessment of how Mugabe fared during these periods, and feel free to give us the good, the bad, and where he made mistakes and what should have been done to correct it. If anything was possible. So let's start then with the first period of Mugabe's rule, the 1980s. So, in terms of socioeconomics and social mobility, how do you assess his rule during this period, which is the final chapter of the Cold War? And do talk to us about Robert Mugabe's foreign policy during the 1980s.
Mugabe, who took over in 1980, maintained a mixed economy in the newly independent Zimbabwe. During the Lancaster House agreements, there was a deal struck that over a period of time, there would not be any massive land reform or land redistribution inside the country. Reforms, of course, did take place. Africans took over the government, and there were other reforms that were made as well. Nonetheless, there was no massive land redistribution system that was instituted. And why was this? Because the British and the United States said they would fund a land redistribution process in order to maintain political and social stability inside of Zimbabwe. This never happened. For 2 whole decades, they had waited and waited. So by 1980, this was the agreement. By 2000, it did not happen. And of course, you had the third Chimurenga, which was instituted beginning in 2000. But the point is, there were divisions between ZANU and ZAPU that had a role to play. And of course, after the Zimbabwe became a republic in 1985, 2 years after that, there was a merger between ZANU-PF and ZAPU-PF. They became one political party. In late 1987, Nkomo returned to the country and became vice president of Zimbabwe, and he served in that role all the way up until the time of his death in 1999. But no, there was not any radical economic reforms or transformation made during the country, although the country was relatively stable during that time period. After the uprising in Matabeleland, after it was put down, there were, of course, disagreements within ZANU as a political party. Some people were purged from the organization, like Edgar Takiri, who was one of the leaders in ZANLA, the armed wing of the system. He was suppressed. He created his own party, but it was never able to gain any type of prominent electoral voice inside the country. And elections were held every 5 years inside the country. There was no period, to my knowledge, where elections were canceled or delayed. Now, the outcome of the elections, of course, became controversial, and we could discuss that later. This was particularly during the 2000s.
Okay, well, let's not get into the 2000s yet,
okay.
but very briefly, let's talk about Mugabe's foreign policy, 1980s, 1990s. It's safe to say, this is, of course, where some of the controversy comes of Robert Mugabe, and you have all of these polarizing conversations when it comes to Robert Mugabe. Now, safe to say he was non-aligned. That he wanted good relations with the West because they were promised radical land reforms and so forth, but also had very good relations. I mean, the North Koreans helped consolidate power. He had good relations with the Chinese, good relations with the Russians. So very much, non-aligned. But in the 1990s, is it safe to say that with the fall of the USSR and so forth, Mugabe became he still, believed in Cuba's right to self-determination, but he became very friendly with the West, and the West would always say, hey, if you help us overthrow Mobutu over here, if you help us, prop up Paul Kagame over here, don't worry, we'll get you your land redistributions. And Mugabe said yes to all of that.
I don't know if he said yes or not, but in the late 70s, I believe it was 1979, ZANU declared their ideology to be Marxism-Leninism.
Okay.
Now, they weren't able to implement that once they came into power. But I just wanted to point it out. The same situation with ZAPU. A lot of the liberation movements during that time period claimed to be Marxist. Frelimo, MPLA, PAIGC, etc. So in that regard, they did. But yes, in the late 1980s, with the collapse of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance states, the Comecon states, in Eastern Europe. For example, the Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the German Democratic Republic, and finally Romania all collapsed in terms of socialism and moved in a capitalist direction, which was a major blow not only to the people of Eastern Europe, but also to the African progressive forces and liberation movements, because they had assisted these groups. Yugoslavia, for example, which was more independent because how the developments took place during World War II, that Tito was strong enough to defeat the fascists on his own and had good relations with the Soviet Union initially, but then they broke because they would not follow the directions of under Stalin.
Yeah.
But after Stalin's death, there was more of a rapprochement between Yugoslavia and the USSR. And of course, after Stalin's death, there was problems later on between China and the Soviet Union, and Albania and the Soviet Union. Albania fell out with the Soviet Union, and eventually China did, beginning in the late 1950s, but of course by 1963, it was an open split, so-called Sino-Soviet split.
Yeah, and China made some very awful decisions in their foreign policy when they did their Sino-Soviet split, but that's a whole other issue for another
Yeah,
day.
it is. We discussed that
Yeah.
when we talked about Angola, how they had supported UNITA up until late December of 1975. Then it became clear they could no longer support them because they were in the bed with the racist apartheid South African Defense Forces. Yes. So yes, the country, although we have to keep it in mind, they were advocates of regional unity through the Southern African Developmental Coordinating Conference. And then later they were co-founders of the Southern African Development Community. They provided assistance to the ANC during the armed struggle and SWAPO as well during their armed struggle. So they didn't compromise in that regard.
Okay.
And Zimbabwe was bombed actually in 1986 by the South African Defense Forces. Even before that, in 1981, Joe Kabi, who was a leader in the ANC, was assassinated in Zimbabwe by agents of the apartheid regime. So no, they did not compromise. Neither did Zambia to the north, because the ANC had a headquarters there as well, and they were bombed. Zimbabwe was bombed. Mozambique had been bombed at Matola in 1981, and the apartheid regime took up the support for the MNR after Zimbabwe became independent in 1980, and they were drained in terms of destabilization caused by these rebel groupings. In 1987, when Samora Machel died in that mysterious plane crash we talked about last week,
Yeah.
Which was laid, to blame on the South African Defense Forces. Zimbabwe denounced these developments, and there were huge demonstrations against the apartheid regime and denouncing the death of Samora Machel. So yes, their position was not socialist or scientific socialist oriented, but at the same time, they still maintained their support for the liberation movements. And they also called for unity in the region as well as throughout the African continent. ZANU-PF was a Pan-Africanist organization. It still remains so in terms of their constitution and their policy positions.
So that's a perfect segue then to the 1990s. So this is the dawn of the unipolar capitalist world led by the U.S. Capitalist globalization has won. The Cold War is done. For some parts of the world, the USSR is dissolved along with the Eastern Communist Bloc. Not all communist nations have dissolved. Robert Mugabe is still reigning supreme. How do you assess this chapter of his rule in terms of domestic socioeconomics, the good, the bad, and the fugly, and his foreign policy legacy during this time? I'll just say very quickly about foreign policy. And again, this is where you have so much controversy and arguments. Mark Curtis, a very brilliant British historian and journalist, who's the co-editor of Declassified UK, and he often looks at uh, declassified documents of the British, of the British state. And he said, and he said that during the Congo crisis, when Mobutu was overthrown in the coup, backed by Western proxies, Paul Kagame and so forth, that Mugabe was actually on the side of the West in ousting in ousting Mobutu and the kind of I wouldn't call it civil war, but basically, Kabila's rise to power. So this is where, this is where, where Mugabe gets under my skin. But putting that aside, talk to us about Robert Mugabe during the 1990s and what were the conditions like for the average Zimbabwean during that period, and other and other policies, good and bad, during Mugabe's time in the 1990s.
Well, the economy, because of the continued existence of the racist apartheid regime up to 1994, was crippled in that regard. So we have to take that into consideration. And also the West, even though they claim they welcomed the democratic transition that led to independence in Zimbabwe, they were never friends of Mugabe and ZANU-PF. From the beginning, they were being accused by the West of human rights violations. Even when Mugabe came to the United States in 1983, he visited Detroit that year, and that's when I met him. And he said, that they're accusing us, of violating human rights, when in fact the whites, who they never criticized, killed thousands of our people. So he, fired back at them in that regard. So we always have to keep these factors in mind as well. So, but during the period of the 1990s, you had the weakening of the Soviet Union, particularly in 1991, it collapsed. And then as a result of that, a lot of assistance and cooperation in the Comecon countries disintegrated. Cuba went into what they called a special period. And Ethiopia collapsed under the Workers' Party of Ethiopia. They were very close to ZANU-PF, Mengistu Haile Mariam. In fact, when he was driven from office in 1991, he took refuge in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe provided him with a home after his collapse in 1991. So yes, in that regard, they were progressive, in my opinion. Now, if we want to talk about what happened in 1996,
go ahead.
In then Zaire, I mean, Mobutu needed to be overthrown. There were many attempts to overthrow him, going all the way back to the late 1970s and during the 1980s. Kabila, Laurent Kabila, for example, no, Joseph Kabila, for example.
Actually, I think it's Laurent Kabila. Laurent
Kabila, the son is Joseph.
Joseph Kabila was the son, yeah.
Yeah, took over. Laurent Kabila had fought with the Lumumbas in the early 1960s and mid 1960s. It documents that in that documentary on Cuba and Africa. I had sent you the links a few weeks ago.
Okay.
And also, they had an organization called the Congolese People's Revolutionary Party, which was attempting to overthrow the neo-colonial regime in Zaire at the time. So Mobutu's government was weakening during the 1990s. There were mass demonstrations against the government, but they could not overthrow it. Even groups headed by the father of Felix Tshisekedi was one of the key players in the domestic struggle in Zaire during the 1990s. But then they were not able to overthrow the government. It was only after the intervention in 1996 by the AFDL, which was the ADF, the Alliance of Democratic Forces for Liberation, that was backed by Rwanda as well as Uganda at the time, and other countries in Southern Africa and East Africa, because of the problems that the Mobutu government had caused going all the way back to the 1960s. In the 1970s, they had backed the counter-revolutionaries in Angola, and they had been very close collaborators with the racist apartheid regime in South Africa. So in 1997, when Mobutu fled the country and the Alliance of Democratic Forces for Liberation took power in May of 1997, a lot of hope existed at that time among progressive forces that Mobutu had been removed. But some suggested that this was just a ruse and that the U.S. wanted to move him out because he had become unuseful to the world in capitalist system.
I definitely go through that point of view.
Okay. So then there was a split in 1998 between the Rwandan government, the Ugandan government, and the government of Laurent Kabila. Okay, so they intervened. Uganda, they set up a group called the RCD. The RCD was like a coalition of rebel groups that were designed to overthrow the Alliance for Democratic Forces in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They changed the name from Zaire to the DRC, which it still remains today. So when they invaded to try to take over on behalf of the Ugandans and Rwandans, and some of these purportedly left forces who were based outside the country, in fact, they were made chairman and all these other groups, with the RCD, and then they split into different factions. But they were not able to do it. And the reason why they were not able to do it is because Angola, Zimbabwe, and Namibia sent their troops in on behalf of the Southern African Development Community to back Kabila and the government in Kinshasa. And they were able to beat back the RCD rebels that were backed by Uganda and Rwanda. Eventually, they had to mediate the situation. And of course, they were not successful. So by 2003, it was all bets were off. They were not going to overthrow the government of Kabila,
who some still argue is a proxy of Rwanda and Uganda. But that's anywho. But that's
Joseph Kabila. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, interestingly enough, he showed up in I believe North Kivu in Goma. Last year,
yes,
and appeared to be supporting the M23.
Yes,
this is what was being reported in the news. So, but who knows what's going to happen in that region?
Yes,
because it's still not stable. And then Trump got involved, claiming he was going to mediate between the Tshisekedi's government and Paul Kagame's government, and they even signed agreements and so forth, but still a lot of instability in the area. There's still fighting that's taking place. And there are other rebel groups as well. The Allied Democratic Forces, the ADF, which now says it's an Islamist organization, a liberation group. They've been carrying out attacks near areas on the border with Uganda. Now, they were against the Ugandan government when they first started, but now it's really not clear if they're being backed by them or not.
So going back, that's very interesting. So then going back to Zimbabwe and their domestic socio-economic policies, talk about Robert Mugabe, a little bit during that period before we get to the final chapter then.
Well, what happened was that around 1998, there was more and more pressure from below within ZANU-PF to move radically towards land reform, because obviously the United States and the British were not going to fund any viable land reform process in Zimbabwe. So then another group came about, opposition group, calling themselves the Movement for Democratic Change.
And this is in the 90s.
Yeah, this is the late 90s.
Okay.
A guy by the name of Morgan Shangarai was the leader of that group, and they engaged in several general strikes to shut the country down, demanding what they called democratic reform in the country. So elections were held in 2000, and there was speculation that the MDC would win the elections. The initial results pointed in that direction. Nonetheless, by the time the elections had been complete, ZANU-PF had triumphed. This was in 2000. There was another election held.
Oh, but actually,
In,
Abayomi, let me interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt
okay,
you
go ahead.
for that, but let me ask this question just about Mugabe in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So, would you say then that because Mugabe adopted a mixed economy, that was the reason why even though you have this very tiny affluent black upper class and a very tiny black bourgeoisie, but still a lot of people in dire poverty, and we're
Yeah,
talking destitution levels of poverty. That because Mugabe didn't pursue more radical left policies like nationalization of the mining industry or nationalization of this industry, uh, if he is supposedly a Marxist Leninist, that because he didn't do that, that's why there were still grotesque levels of poverty in Zimbabwe, not just in the 1980s, but continuing on in the 1990s.
yeah, I would say partly that's accurate. But Zimbabwe doesn't exist in isolation. It's a landlocked country. They had to assist Mozambique in preventing the MNR from overthrowing the Frelimo government. They sent 10,000 of their troops, Zimbabwe Defense Forces troops, to secure the Bara corridor during the 1980s, which saved the Frelimo government in Mozambique. So yes, there were a lot of pressure on them to try to secure their closest ally, which was Frelimo. Now, ZANU-PF, ZANLA, utilized Mozambique as a rear base after they became independent in 1975. And that sped up the gains of the national liberation movements in southern Rhodesia, which later became Zimbabwe. But they don't function in isolation. And the fact that you had the crumbling of the world socialist system, the one that was based in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, was a major impediment to Cuba and other countries that considered themselves socialists around the world.
And South Africa, racial apartheid ended, but economic
In
apartheid
1994.
still remained there, or neoliberalism, as people love to say that.
Right, right.
Okay.
Namibia gained its independence in 1990, and that was a major advancement in terms of defeating the apartheid system in Southern Africa. This set the stage for the negotiations and eventually multi-party elections in 1994 in South Africa. But there were tremendous challenges, tremendous hurdles that had to be overcome. Uh, Thousands upon thousands of people lost their lives in South Africa, even between 1990, after Mandela and the others were released, and the period of the multi-party elections in 1994. They set Gasha Buthelezi, the so-called Inkatha Freedom Movement, later the Inkatha Freedom Party, against the ANC, which caused a tremendous amount of dislocation. And the Inkatha Party was backed by the racist apartheid regime, just like the MNR in Mozambique, just like UNITA in Angola. So all this has to be taken into consideration when you make decisions, about the developments in Zimbabwe, which was a landlocked country. But in terms of development, the development there, even today, is still far superior than in other African countries. And that had a lot to do with the inheritance of settler colonialism, but also the fact that it's been relatively stable political system there over the last 46 years. ZANU-PF has maintained control of the state since 1980, and it has not been, it was an internal coup d'etat that took place in 2017. But prior to that, there was never any military coup or even right-wing takeover of the government, which there were many attempts to bring this about. I mentioned 2000 during the parliamentary election.
Oh,
then
actually, don't worry. We're going to get there now. We're going to get there. So we come now to the second to last chapter of Mugabe's rule, and probably his most controversial period, or controversial if you support him and reject popular Western corporate media and Western state media coverage, and the African media that often recycles those narratives. So here we are. So 2000 up until 2010, this is how Mugabe's period was popularly covered in the media I just described. Robert Mugabe was a great anti-colonial leader. He overthrew apartheid in his own country and was a wonderful leader. But then, like George Orwell's Animal Farm, he becomes a dictator. He got rid of his own rivals, the oppositions, and his own rivals within his own party. And while there needs to be a redistribution of wealth and ownership of the largely rural country and empower the farmers, the way Robert Mugabe went about it was very much like the critics of the Shah. He forcibly evicted white farmers and was governing like a reverse racist and persecuting them. And he was and he was not giving them to farmers who worked the land for intergenerational centuries or decades, but to a bunch of his cronies who didn't manage the land properly. And then he goes full dictatorship and carries out policies like Operation Take Out the Trash, where he attacks his opponents in areas that are largely against him and his fellow poor Africans. And he's constantly beating up and trying to murder his opponents like Morgan Tsvangirai and the movement for democracy people. And this is why the Bush administration and the Tony Blair government in Britain and the Canadian governments and others in the EU put sanctions on Mugabe, and he's kicked out of the Commonwealth, although he was always kicked out of that's strange. Mugabe, they're a republic. Anyways, and then both the late Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela denounce him and call him a dictator. Your response, which I know, again, is going to be controversial, but to many controversials, your response.
Oh, well, these narratives are typical, of any African state that has taken a position against the West. They said the same thing about Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, that he had become a dictator, a communist, and that justified his removal by the military. So it was a similar situation in Zimbabwe. They had even tried to talk to the Republic of South Africa government that was then headed by the ANC about blockading, because South Africa is a very, very important gateway for Zimbabwe trade. So they wanted to set up a blockade to stifle the country and strangle the Zimbabwe government. Of course, South Africa refused to do that. And they did continue to support the ZANU-PF government because they're all part of the Southern African Development Community. In that regard, they failed, meaning the Western countries in their schemes. But the MDC, it's clear, was supported by the West. There was even efforts to have Mugabe assassinated, which failed as well. But the MDC had no real political program other than removing Robert Mugabe. That was their program. And subsequent groups, like there was one in 2018 that ran for office, and he too was not successful in terms of removing the ZANU-PF government as the ruling party. But in 2000, there was parliamentary elections, which ZANU-PF was able to secure a majority. In 2002, there were presidential elections, which Mugabe was declared the winner. And then in 2008, There was elections that were very close, and people all over the world, even the putative left in North America, were essentially saying the same thing as the imperialists. Uh, we don't have to name names, but but some of these people, very questionable backgrounds, high positions in the AFL-CIO, all these type of people who were denouncing ZANU-PF, denouncing Robert Mugabe, and so forth, really had no program for people inside this country either. And but I think that in 2008, the outcome of that was the formation of a global political agreement. It was a coalition government that was set up in 2008. Morgan Tsvangirai was made prime minister that year. Mugabe remained president. And they set up a cabinet that was composed of both ZANU-PF and MDC leaders. And this lasted for like 5 years, this whole process. By that time, the MDC had lost tremendous support. So they pretty much collapsed after that.
And why do you think they lost support? And if you do reject the narrative that Robert Mugabe is this all-powerful dictator and his cronies are beating up people and blah, 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 and that's how he's winning election after election, then if you do reject that, then why do you think then Zimbabweans continue to elect Robert Mugabe, or maybe not even Mugabe himself, just ZANU-PF? I would be very curious your response to that.
Well, they're the party of the National Liberation Movement. And their position was, through the state media, like the Herald and Zimbabwe Chronicle and so forth, promoted the narrative that the opposition was supported by the United States, by Britain, Australia, and the European Union. That's how they played it. So between 2008 and 2013, the coalition government, that whole process was a very shrewd political maneuver on the part of ZANU-PF, because the leadership of the MDC mainly were just opportunists. They just wanted money and they wanted government positions. And they lost public support during that time period. So they pretty much collapsed. And Mugabe was able to maintain control up until 2017, when there was an internal split inside of ZANU-PF. And as a result of that, the current leader, Emerson Mnangagwa, came to power in 2017, and then he ran in the elections.
So that's very interesting. So, but before we talk about Mugabe's ouster, then let me ask you this question then, which was any of what I said about Robert Mugabe in my previous question characterization? Would you say there are half-truths to any of it? If so, which are the half-truths, or which are just the full-on fake news, junk history, junk journalism regarding Mugabe during this period, particularly the whole Operation Take Out the Trash, where it was depicted on ITV, BBC, Dutch outlets, German outlets, French outlets, as just, like him, targeting, his political opponents and so forth like that.
Yeah, well, even left groups, outlets like Democracy Now!, for example.
Exactly.
Always have been, anti-Zimbabwe during that period. And they were against Gaddafi in Libya. They made excuses even for the NATO blanket bombing of Libya during that time period. And of course, they were against ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. So Mugabe did rule the country with an iron fist. There's no question about it. But if he hadn't have done that, what would have been the outcome? You would have had an MDC, for example, taking power in 2000, 2002, or 2008, and it would be like Syria is today. You'd have a government that was pliant with world imperialism, would have been a British neo-colony or an American neo-colony. And the fact that they've been able to survive for 26 years or more under the most draconian sanctions level pretty much against, in comparison to any other country in Africa, I think is a tribute to their fortitude and their political ingenuity.
Interesting.
Because otherwise, there is no left opposition in Zimbabwe, as far as I can see. There was an effort to try to organize a Zimbabwe Communist Party a few years ago. I don't think it went anywhere. So I don't know where the left opposition really is at this point in Zimbabwe. If they say they're to the left of ZANU-PF, and right now there's a controversy around whether Emerson Mnangagwa should run for a third term. So we'll see what happens out of that as well.
So, you know what? Before I ask my question about Mugabe's last period in powers, and we talk about BRICS and whatnot, and I do have to ask this question. I couldn't find this article on Minpress News, but it was a very good article on Minpress News, and I think it was reprinted on the Gray Zone about National Endowment of Democracy, USAID, and some of these other CIA cutout front groups that you can imagine, and apparently one of the reporters, but I can't remember if it was. Can't remember his name. I'm completely blanking out on his name. But in the article, which I couldn't find, they said that those groups, along with the guy who owned Virgin Airlines, why am I blanking out on his name? The guy who owned Virgin Airlines.
Yeah, I can understand why you blank out on him.
Geez, what was his name?
They had a record company before that.
Yes, 70s. exactly. Yeah. That guy.
Yeah. But the land reform is what really.
Wait a minute. I'm gonna find that person's name later. But yeah. He's a very important player. But anyways, that guy. So this article by Minpress in the Gray Zone basically exposed that that USAID, National Endowment with Democracy, was working with this British oligarch, who does planes, who sometimes goes out into space and so forth. But basically, they were funding the MDC and Morgan Tsvangirai and so forth. And that's and when I found out about that, that's why I. To use the ChatGPT term, that's why I sometimes have more nuance now when it comes to Robert Mugabe and his critics. So
yeah.
So talk to us about the MDC, and do you really think that they had no left alternative program to the ruling ZANU-PF?
No, obviously not. If you read their documents, they were opposed to the land reform program, which was initiated in 2000, was voted on by the parliament. This is something that had been blocked for 20 years by the British and by the US. So yes, they're going to be upset when you have Africans who take back control of what is rightfully theirs. And this is what happened in 2000. They took 50%
just
of the
a
land.
Second. Richard Branson.
Yeah,
that's the guy I was thinking of.
Yeah, right. You see him a lot on the BBC and other British television outlets. Yeah, but those are the people that supported the Morgan Tsvangirai. He eventually died in subsequent years. But yes, these are the people who supported the MDC and the other group that came about several years ago that challenged ZANU-PF in the 2018 elections as well. But land reform was the main issue that really heavily turned the tide against the ZANU-PF government. And the land reform, although they said it was disastrous, and they said that it broke the economy and so forth, in actuality.
And that Mugabe wasn't distributing it to the farmers themselves who had worked the land. Yeah. He was just distributing it to cronies who mishandled the farm and whatnot.
Yeah, I don't believe that. I don't believe that was accurate, because what you had was an increase in production, particularly towards the latter 2000s, particularly in the tobacco industry and other industries. was a boon in terms of production because they had broken up a lot of the plantation type agricultural production and went to smaller agricultural production inside the country.
Okay,
So, as
interesting.
nobody, as far as I know, people are not starving to death in Zimbabwe like you see in other African countries. They have been hit by some natural disasters, like neighboring Mozambique. But no, you know, there's high unemployment. There's problems with the economy, but you have to look at the draconian sanctions that have been imposed on Zimbabwe by Britain, by the United States, which still remain today. Even though Mugabe has been out of office for almost 9 years now, 8.5 years.
And,
And
and dead on top of that?
yeah, he passed away in 2019. So I mean, what is the big deal? ZANU-PF is still in power. That's what the reality is, and they have not completely reversed. There have been some changes in the land reform program, but they have not completely reversed it, and they have not turned the land over completely back to the European settler farmers. You also have problems with drought, climate change, which also is a factor in terms of agricultural production and so forth in Zimbabwe. But we'll see what happens coming up because there's a move inside ZANU-PF to get Emerson Mnangagwa to run again for president of the country. We don't know whether that's going to actually take place, but there is a movement in that regard. But I don't know what the opposition is doing right now. I'm sure they'll get Trump or somebody to fund them, perhaps even Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, because Tony Blair was a big supporter of the opposition as well. And he hated Mugabe. Yeah, right.
Now, before we talk about current affairs in Zimbabwe, let me then ask you this question, which is so that's very interesting. So talk to us a little bit about Mugabe's last period in power and the last years of his life. Then, what led him to being ousted in the coup? And when he was ousted in the coup, I'm very curious your answer to this. What was the response of much of the Pan-Africanist left in Africa and the diaspora regarding Mugabe being forced to resign from Black Agenda Reports, your own Pan-African Newswire, the African People's Socialist Party in the U.S. and its chapters in Canada and elsewhere, and the Black is Back coalition led by Chairman O'Malley? I'm very curious because I couldn't find really any articles that talked about Mugabe being ousted and his legacy, the good and the bad, and so forth. I'm very curious your response.
Well, I did a lot of interviews in 2017 and 2018 about the transition in Zimbabwe. Those articles are still, up online. Interview with the China Global Television Network.
Oh, feel free to send those links so I can post them.
Yeah. But at the same time, there were leftists, so-called leftists in this country and in the UK that bitterly opposed ZANU-PF and Mugabe. So, that's the reality of the situation. But fortunately, they weren't. Fortunately, they weren't the dominant trend in terms of the solidarity movement. But what led to his ouster, in my opinion, was that there was a split inside of ZANU-PF. His wife, Dr. Grace Mugabe, became a prominent figure inside of ZANU-PF politics, inside the Zimbabwe government. There were rumors that he was going to designate her as his heir apparent. People were opposed to that. She had angered a lot of people in high positions inside the party. They were trying to remove Emerson Mnangagwa in 2017. He had to go into hiding. And the ZANU-PF Youth League was threatening the military. So they just made a move to put Mugabe under house arrest. They took over charge of the state. That's the Zimbabwe Defense Forces. And the Southern African Development Community, particularly the Foreign Ministry of the Republic of South Africa, tried to mediate the situation between Mugabe and those opposing him, particularly the current president, Mnangagwa, as well as Chiwenga, who was head of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces at the time. So Mugabe did not prevail. The majority of the people within the party during that time period, there was a debate held, impeachment hearings were held in Harare, in the capital, and before the hearings were complete, Mugabe sent in his resignation. So that's how his reign ended. And that was in 2017. And then eventually, Emerson Mnangagwa was inaugurated as head of as president of the Republic of Zimbabwe, and also as head of the ZANU-PF political party. And he's
So,
maintained
so, so,
that
so,
position since 2017. Yeah,
so it was an internal uh,
yeah, that's what
immature
got him
thing that
out.
happened
Yeah,
within ZANU-PF that led to Mugabe being ousted, but not,
right.
so not an external Western imperial color revolution co-opting sort of thing that happened.
There may have been elements of that there because there was a rally that was held several days before he was ousted or before he resigned, which brought together all these different opposition forces in Harare. But the actual forces that brought about his demise was internal, and that was within the ZANU-PF party.
So, since the 24th of November, 2017, Zimbabwe has
Mm-hmm.
been covered by Emerson. How do you say his last name?
Mnangagwa,
Okay, who is a member of the same political party as the late Robert Mugabe,
a
ZANU-PF.
high-ranking official. He was vice president prior to him being removed and then taking power again.
So I have to ask this question, which is how do you assess his time in office so
Mm-hmm.
far? So far, has social mobility improved, life expectancy, employment, standards of living? Are white people free to roam and live comfortable lives while the vast majority are in destitute poverty and race relations are all hunky dory? Have sanctions been lifted? And when is Zimbabwe going to be subjected to IMF, World Bank austerity if it hasn't been already? I'm very curious.
Well, they have. They have definitely been subjected to austerity imposed, by the Western imperialist states, by international finance capital. And Emerson Mnangagwa has maintained unity in Zimbabwe. He has maintained ZANU-PF, the liberation movement that fought for the liberation of the country, intact inside the country. So he's been a success in that regard. But still, they have not been able, they've made many attempts to try to, quote, normalize, unquote, for use of a better term, relations with the US and Britain. It's a little bit better with the European Union, but no. They have very good relations with China. They do a lot of trade with China and joint projects with China. Also, Belarus, and also some of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries as well have been involved in economic projects in Zimbabwe. But no, they have not been able to bring down the ZANU-PF government. And like I said before, uh, there's a discussion right now about whether or not he should run for a third term in the country. So these are some of the dynamics of what is going on inside of Zimbabwe.
You already answered a little bit of my question about BRICS and whether he's pivoting more to Western alliance, but I actually do want to ask this question regarding BRICS, which is what was Zimbabwe? So under Mugabe, relations with Russia, both when it was under the USSR and later when it was under Yeltsin, were good, as well as when Putin came into power. Then, or
Most definitely, and China as well. Yeah,
and what about
the
and what about and then what about South Africa and Brazil? Because it's quite interesting that Robert Mugabe, at least if you're a supporter of his, many people say he wanted to pursue more radical socioeconomic left politics, but was hamstrung because of the West and another and it's just interesting that he towards the end of his life was trying to pursue that, at least when it comes to land reform, and yet
Yeah.
Mugabe had always maintained good relations with South Africa, which has never. The ANC has never pursued any of the policies that's in the Freedom Charter. Has remained,
Mhm.
unfortunately, very neo-colonial and neoliberalism, but they still maintain good relations with Mugabe, and that is still continuing under the current president Emerson, correct? Or
Yeah, most definitely. The Southern African Development Community is the most cohesive regional formation on the continent. And that is what has held back uh, potential military coups. There hasn't been a military coup in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, Angola, Botswana, South Africa, Malawi, or Namibia, Zambia. Zambia has moved further to the right, but other than that, no, I don't see any of those developments taking place. In Lesotho, there was military coup in 1986, and then there was another one later in 1994. But they have returned to multi-party democratic rule as well. And Lesotho, of course, being a landlocked country in Southern Africa, which played a key role in the armed struggle against South Africa.
and Zimbabwe and India get along more or less. They have a very cordial relationship. Zimbabwe and India and BRICS.
Yeah, yeah, they do. Yeah, they really do. But Zimbabwe is facing the same crisis as other African countries across the continent, in the subcontinent, the Southern African Development Community. Climate change is a factor. The ongoing sanctions. There's an international movement that's been going on for years, demanding the lifting of sanctions on the part of the United States and Britain and their allies against Zimbabwe. Every year in October, they have these huge end sanctions campaigns. The African Union is on board with that. SADC is on board with that. And of course, people in the United States, the ones that do support Zimbabwe, for example, the December 12th movement out of New York is one of them. And the former Patrice Lumumba coalition that was headed by Alambe Braith, who passed away perhaps a dozen years ago or so in New York, were staunch supporters and defenders of ZANU-PF, as well as Kabila in the DRC. The Alambe, that Patrice Lumumba coalition was staunch supporters. And later, the December 12th movement, which still exists. Omawale Clay, they're largely based in Brooklyn. They have demonstrations in support of Zimbabwe every year during the United Nations General Assembly. Hands off Zimbabwe, in the sanctions on Zimbabwe. The so-called left critics of Zimbabwe may have a better position or better case if sanctions were lifted, but they have not been lifted. And these people have never called for the lifting of sanctions. Even the people in this country, this group they had started 27 years ago called the Black Radical Congress. The leadership of that group was anti-Zimbabwe. I don't have to name, I don't want to get into, make this personal, name the names of people, but it fizzled, those type of groupings, because they're largely petty bourgeois oriented. They have a lot of academics, but they don't do any real organizing work in the communities. And that's why they're not going to sustain themselves. But yes, we'll see what happens, in Zimbabwe later on this year. And we'll see, if Emerson Mnangagwa is able to maintain his position as the leader of ZANU-PF and whether or not they'll be able to prevail in another election.
Very
their
quick.
elections are monitored.
Yeah.
They're monitored by SADC, by the African Union, and by other international entities. Now, they have denied in the past the right of the United States and others to come in and monitor their elections, in which they have a right to do, as a sovereign state. They don't have to allow these people to come in and make a decision over whether or not their elections are free and fair. Look at the United States. You know what
Well,
happened in 2000 in the United States, where
it's
the election was stolen by the Republicans in the state of Florida. In 2004, it was stolen by them again in the state of Ohio in 2004. In 2020, there was controversy over the elections. Trump was claiming that the elections were stolen from him. In 2024, there are people who are saying that Trump stole the elections in 2024, although the Democrats never challenged what he was doing. I mean, you got a Donald Trump who's been convicted on what, 34 different felony counts. He has a civil adjudicated rapist conviction. You know, he's been impeached twice. You know, and he's still in office.
yeah, and
So, I mean,
well,
how could
and
his government criticize anybody anywhere around the world?
yeah, no, I always, I always laugh now when in Western corporate media and even pseudo leftist outlets like Al Jazeera, every time there's an announcement that some country somewhere is closing down all of these semi NGOs from basically
Yes.
doing their color revolutions, there's always this big like, oh my gosh, this is disgusting. How dare they do that? But then once you start analyzing like who gets their money from where, you realize actually this is a pretty good thing that they're doing. So see ya wouldn't want to be ya. But
Well,
um,
even Burma, which is today Myanmar, they arrested a guy, a Jewish guy from Detroit a few years back. And when I looked to see who's financing these journalistic groups, they're right out of the State Department, you know, and
exactly.
they fund these groups that promote, certain narratives against these countries. I'm not defending the Myanmar government, which is militarily dominated, but at the same time, uh, the U.S. has its hands in many of these color revolutions, coup d'etats, and so forth, even among people who have been allies of U.S. imperialism. Look at Uganda, for example. You know,
Mm-hmm.
if they can overthrow Youri Museveni, they probably would. And so we have to keep an eye on all of this because a lot of times, even bad leaders are still targeted by their former uh, allies and supporters, as in the case of Uganda, Rwanda, and so forth.
Exactly. Very
And even
quickly.
the DRC. Look,
Yeah.
they have migrants who have been illegally detained and deported from the United States that have been sent to the DRC just this week. Why are they accepting, these people from the Trump administration, other Africans, and all of them are from the global South, either from Africa or Latin America. I mean, this is outrageous. They
Exactly.
shouldn't be doing this. This is another form of the Atlantic slave trade.
Exactly.
And they're doing it in exchange for what? A few cheaper, I don't know, economic deals or perhaps, some type of lower rates for visas and all of this kind of stuff. It's absolutely absurd.
Exactly. Very quickly, second to last question. What's been President Emerson's response to the anti-French wave African Spring in West Africa?
I'm not sure what their position is because they were colonized by the British. And prior to that,
By the French.
yeah, I mean, Zimbabwe was colonized by
Oh, okay.
the British. And prior to that, they had problems with the Portuguese, although they were not able to penetrate deeply into Zimbabwe. But the ancient Zimbabwe kingdom also covered a part of today's modern days Mozambique. So, no, I don't know exactly what their position is on that, but I'm sure they are for uh, genuine independence and sovereignty in West Africa as well. Now, they still take a very strong position in support of Palestine, and that's Zimbabwe, and also the Western Sahara, the Polisario Front, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. They have outlets, they have an embassy there, as well as in South Africa, despite the fact that there's a lot of pressure, to recognize Morocco's sovereignty over the Western Sahara. I understand even Mali recently recognized this purported autonomy deal that Morocco has put forward for the SADR. And Mali, of course, is one of the alliance of Sahel states that exist and has been moving more towards Russia and have kicked out France as well as the United States troops. Although the U.S. has been engaging in some type of dialogue between those states around the question of security. But the issue is that the Al Qaeda groups, the ISIS groups, are clearly being backed by U.S. imperialism and their allies. And these are the ones that are causing all the problems right now in West Africa and other parts of Africa as well.
And my last question is the following. So, regardless of whatever mistakes Mugabe did, Zimbabwe is still is still somewhat in a very rough shape, like any African country or region. The poverty is still quite extreme. It's intolerable that vast majority in a nation with as much rich resources as in Zimbabwe, the population is still living in very horrific, abject poverty and destitution. But all that being said, isn't, again, the only solution that of socialism, radical socialism, regardless of any mistakes made in the past by the ruling ZANU-PF, which is supposed to be a post-colonial African socialist party. I'm very curious your response.
Yes, and I think there has to be unity. That's the only way socialism can effectively be built on the continent. It's not going to be built in isolation. And as long as you have the interference in the internal affairs of these states, even small countries like Lesotho, for example, last year, Trump put 50% tariffs on all their goods. I mean, how can you do that in a country that is landlocked and has approximately 2 million residents and is already suffering from impoverishment? And the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, had been eliminated. Now it's been renewed temporarily by the Trump administration, but a lot of damage had already been done because they were producing textiles products for export to the United States. This was a deal that was set up under the Clinton administration at the end of his tenure in around 2000. So it's creating more and more unemployment. And that's the situation that's going on across Africa. And we've seen the tariffs having a negative impact. But I don't think in the long term they're going to be successful, meaning U.S. imperialism, because Trump and every project he embarks upon has proved to be a failure. I mean, sending in the National Guard, ICE, and the Marines into major municipalities in the United States have met resistance. Minneapolis, was outstanding. Even though 2 people were killed and 1 person was shot, they had to withdraw that surge that they had carried out in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Chicago, there was widespread resistance to the notion of deploying the National Guard. The governor and the mayor of Chicago both issued executive orders prohibiting the deployment of National Guard in Chicago. And we've seen this in other cities, Los Angeles, where they put the National Guard in and people fought them in the streets. The Marines were also put into Los Angeles as well, and they had to be withdrawn. They were threatening to put National Guards into Detroit. That hasn't happened yet. But ICE is still on the rampage in various cities across the country, and there still needs to be a struggle waged against the presence of ICE. So the point I'm making is that they tried to take over the government in Iran. They killed the supreme leader. They killed other top leaders in Iran, but they have not prevailed against Iran. And now they're doing everything they can to try to make it appear as if they prevailed, that the Iranian government is divided. They're not divided. The US government is the one that can't articulate what their strategic objectives are in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
What they're realizing is that Iran has the capacity to defend itself. They did tremendous damage in the Zionist entity over the nearly month-long, longer than a month, actually almost 40-day war. Their puppets in the Persian Gulf Arab monarchies have been severely destabilized. The Fifth Fleet, they had to move their forces out of their barracks in Bahrain. Look at what's happening in Dubai. That place was like a paradise, for U.S. imperialism. They had their banks there, their corporations were there, the U.S. troops. They were just having a great time. Tourists on the beaches and in the clubs, all of that. Where is it at right now? So I don't think U.S. imperialism and the extreme form under Trump is going to prevail. There's going to be a lot of suffering. A lot of people have died. A lot more probably will die. But I believe in the long term that the U.S. imperialist system is already in decline, will completely collapse, like other empires throughout history. The Roman Empire, ancient Greece, the British Empire, the French, the Portuguese
Well,
have
here's
all
so
been
well,
weakened.
and here
So
and here's hoping when American imperialism collapses, they take all the pan-European empires with them too. So
they're already split. Trump was begging the British, the French to join him in bombing Iran, and they refused. Even NATO, look what he's done to the NATO countries. Demanding that they pay at least 5%, allocate 5% of their national budgets to defense. And it's causing more and more problems in Europe as well. Poverty in Britain, France, Spain has totally rejected it. I even heard that in Belgium, the foreign ministry raised some objections to what Trump is doing, and also objections to the policies of the Israeli Zionist entity. So this is very interesting what is happening. So as the crisis deepens, we'll have more divisions within the world imperialist system, which is a good thing for people of the global South, because Trump's unilateralism is proving to be a complete failure. And formations like BRICS and the non-aligned movement, the group of 77 plus China, all of them, of course, are moving towards multilateralism and de-dollarization. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think just the thought of it, just the advocacy of it, is causing fear and panic within the circles of U.S. imperialism.
Interesting. Well, we were once again joined on this all things Africa edition, our journey across the African continent with Abayomi Azikiwe, a Pan-African Newswire, independent journalist and historian extraordinaire, Pan-Africanist, leftist, anti-imperialist activist, also involved in all the great people power movements. Check out his work and that of his colleagues at both Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports. And I should be plugging this group more, the anti-imperialist Black-led organization, Black Alliance for Peace, which does so much political education, which is vitally important. Check out their and of course check out our entire series on 1+1 on the continent, which I'll put in the Pen comments section, and donate generously to these outlets and organizations. Please donate to 1+1, and again to my friend and colleague Chris Richards. Now, next week, this is what I'm hoping, folks. Next week, we will try to do the following. I'm hoping to get a Zimbabwean leftist who was a critic of Mugabe on the program to debate the legacy of Mugabe with Abayomi, and it'll be very light. It'll be very polite and so forth, I hope. So I hope we can arrange that next week. But if we aren't able to arrange this debate, then the next country that we will explore next week or the week after will be Botswana. So stay tuned for that, and I promise to update everybody on if this is even happening on my YouTube posts. Until then, have a great weekend, folks. Good night. Good luck. All my best.